Since the 1700s, the United States has fought numerous wars against Native American tribes. This string of conflicts is known as the Indian Wars, and many people view the infamous massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890 as the end of these wars. This was indeed the last major act of violence between the United States Army and Indian nations. However, the final battle between the United States Armed Forces and Native Americans was surprisingly in 1918. Even more surprisingly, the battle was started by accident. On today's episode of Bet You Didn't Know History, we're diving into the Battle of Bear Valley in Arizona. It was January 1918. Virtually all the American armed forces were busy fighting in the Great War, which would come to be known as World War I. The Doughboys, along with other Allied troops, were slowly pushing the Germans back and advancing through Belgium. The war would drag on for another 10 bloody months. Meanwhile, in Arizona, things were pretty boring. The 10th Cavalry was deployed here to defend the border between Mexico and the US. Students of history might recognize this famous regiment. Known as the Buffalo Soldiers, this all-black regiment fought valiantly in several conflicts. Notably, they took part in the Indian Wars against the Plains tribes. But this was the age of machine guns and trench warfare. Soldiers on horseback were no longer useful, and the regiment's days of fighting natives were seemingly long over. Because of this, the 10th Cavalry was sent to guard the Arizona-Mexico border. There was no border patrol at this time. However, there was a small ongoing conflict in the region. A tribe known as the Yaqui were fighting the Mexican government. They were attempting to establish an independent homeland for themselves in the Mexican region of Sonora. In 1910, the Mexican Revolution began and the Yaqui had allied themselves with the rebels. Ultimately, the rebels would win, but by 1916, Mexican generals were claiming Yaqui lands as their own. This started a war between the Yaqui and the Mexican government. America was pulled into this regional conflict for several reasons. First, Mexican General Plutarco Elias Calles asked the US to stop the Yaquis because they were illegally transporting weapons across the border. Yaquis would cross the border into Arizona where they would take jobs. They would then work until they could afford to buy supplies, specifically weapons and ammunition. Then the Yaquis would cross the border and use their weapons to fight the Mexican government. The second reason that the US was pulled into this conflict was because American citizens were complaining that Yaquis were killing their livestock. The third and final reason the US was pulled into this conflict was because there was probably a fear that the war would spill into America. This happened before in 1916 when, as a result of the Mexican Revolution, the rebel Pancho Villa came into the US and murdered American citizens. But that's a story for another day. Back to the Yaquis. On January 8, 1918, a cattleman named Philip C. Clark rode into the 10th Cavalry's camp. He reported that a freshly killed cow was found in the mountains. It looked as though it had been skinned for sandals. This was a common practice among the Yaquis, so the 10th Cavalry assumed it was them. As a response, the 10th Cavalry mobilized. Parts of the regiment went to watch trails frequented by the Yaqui. The next day, these soldiers signaled to the rest of the regiments that they had spotted the Yaquis. Around 30 troopers from the regiment rode out to intercept the Yaqui. They dismounted and advanced through the canyon where the Yaqui were spotted. Finding nothing, the troopers went back to their horses. Along the way, they found discarded packs. The Yaqui had definitely been here, probably recently. The troopers continued through the canyon when suddenly the Yaqui opened fire from concealed positions. The 10th Cavalry fired back and the battle turned into an old-style Indian engagement, with both sides using all the natural cover of boulders and brush to their full advantage. The Yaquis kept falling back, dodging from boulder to boulder and firing rapidly. After about 30 minutes, the shooting lessened. Cavalry troopers began moving up the canyon toward the Yaquis. Then one Yaqui jumped out of the brush, waving his hands above his head. 10 more Yaquis emerged from the bushes. Ultimately, 11 Yaquis were captured. They did not speak any English but did speak Spanish, so one of the Buffalo Soldiers who spoke Spanish communicated with them. The Yaquis were shocked. They thought that the Buffalo Soldiers were Mexican Army soldiers due to their complexion. They had not meant to attack the US Army. It was a case of mistaken identity. The Yaqui chief who was shot during the battle would die the next day in a military hospital. He was the only casualty of this battle. And that was the last time the US Army fought Native Americans. In 1918, while most people were concerned with the Great War. This skirmish was ironic because the 10th Cavalry, famous for fighting native tribes, participated in the last battle of the Indian Wars. Interestingly, the official end of the Indian Wars was in 1925. With the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, any subsequent violent interactions between Native American tribes and US citizens would be classified as crimes and not part of any war. The Battle of Bear Valley, as this skirmish would come to be known, marked the end of an era. It was the end of the bloody Indian Wars, which was a good thing. Thousands lost their lives in these terrible wars, which were uniquely horrible as innocent bystanders on both sides were often murdered. But it was also the official end of Native American resistance to the stealing of their land. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing.